WCW had a lot of main event players on its roster over the years, names like Ric Flair, Hollywood Hogan, and Sting, just to name a few. But that's not what made it special. No, what really made it great was the company's excellent mid-card performers such as Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and Rey Mysterio. And then there's the level of wrestlers who, for one reason or another, have been lost to time. But who are the most forgotten names in WCW history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start with this subject than with Lash Laroo. Yes, as we mentioned a moment ago, WCW had an excellent cruiserweight division during its peak years in the latter half of the 90s. Hell, we've not even mentioned people like Dean Malenko, Psychosis, Juventud Guerrera, or Chris Benoit yet. But one name who often gets lost when discussing the roster of smaller guys in Atlanta back then is one Lash Laroo. And that's a shame because while he was unlikely to be a Hall of Famer or anything like that, Laroo certainly had a lot to offer as a high flyer. It didn't matter if he was working as a solo act facing off against the likes of Disco Inferno or Billy Kidman, or as part of the Misfits in Action stable where he briefly underwent a name change and started going instead by the moniker of Corporal Cajun. Lash was always a dependable part of the WCW roster who could be plugged into whatever was asked of him on any given episode of Nitro or Thunder. Sure, he was never in any real title contention, outside of a brief run with the WCW tag team titles alongside Lieutenant Loco during the hellscape that was WCW in 2000 that was, but that didn't mean the Alabama native didn't still have his fans. And those fans would stick by him all the way to the end of WCW and beyond as it happened, because once that company folded in 2001, we'd continue to see Laroo pop up in places like TNA for a few years yet. Did he deserve better? Maybe. But then, not everyone can get to be a main event level guy. And in the end, this was the sad reality for Lash Laroo, just as it was also the sad reality for our next subject, another member of the Misfits in Action, Sergeant Awall. That's right, say what you will about Vince Russo, but he certainly knew how to come up with some truly dad-worthy puns when it came to naming wrestlers. And unfortunately for Sergeant Awall, that was just about the most memorable thing from his entire run in WCW. To be fair though, under his prior gimmick in WCW, he did do something that was more memorable, and that was because before being a member of the Misfits in Action, he briefly portrayed the character of The Wall. Who was The Wall? He was a big guy that wore a shirt and tie and who served as the bodyguard for the equally short-lived Berlin. After this short run though, the big man would drop the gimmick entirely and instead would take a short hiatus, all before returning as the even worse Sergeant Awall. What happened once he fully pledged his allegiance to the Misfits in Action then? Not a great deal, as by early 2001 not only would that group have split up, but WCW as a whole would have gone out of business. And despite the fact he was big and had a certain presence about him, everything Vince McMahon usually looked for in a new main eventer post-Attitude Era, Sergeant Awall would never get his chance to shine on the WWF main roster after that. No, he'd never do much more of note in wrestling at this point. The same of which could be said for our next subject when they also left WCW in 2000, the one, the only, the Maestro. Yes, we're discussing some fairly obscure characters today, but the Maestro might take the cake. So if you don't remember this one, then we truly wouldn't blame you. After all, with a very short career in WCW, it's very easy to forget Robert Kellem's contributions as a whole. But he must have done something, right? Well, after signing with the promotion in 1999, following runs in places like AAA, USWA, and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, the Raleigh native would get some TV time upon entering into a feud with Evan Courageous over the WCW Cruiserweight title. Unfortunately, though, he wouldn't be able to win this belt here. And once that program was over, he'd be reduced to even lower down on the card feuds against the likes of Norman Smiley, Ernest the Cat Miller, and David Flair. Yes, it is true he briefly got to lock it up with Buff Bagwell while Bagwell was arguably at his most relevant. But given this happened in 2000, no one was able to come out of this situation looking good. No, even if the Maestro was a fairly regular fixture on Nitro and Thunder by then, he probably wished he wasn't. And it wouldn't get much better for Robert Kellem once his time with WCW came to an end either, as rather than get a shot in a place like WWF, he'd instead spend what remained of his career working on the indies. That's right, it seems like it was a common thing following the fall of WCW for those mid-card guys who often went forgotten to end up losing out, as with there only being so many spots available in the WWF, the only major game in town by then, there was little they could do to find notable work. It was a problem faced by Lash Laroo, it was a problem faced by Sergeant Awall, and it was a problem faced by the Maestro too. And it was most certainly a problem faced by our next subject, Blitzkrieg. Yes, Blitzkrieg was actually a very good wrestler. Certainly good enough to make his presence felt in a cruiserweight division which also included some of the names we've already mentioned. Names like Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and Rey Mysterio. So why didn't he end up becoming a bigger deal then? That's hard to say. We suppose it was just difficult to fully break out from the pack with all the talent on display elsewhere. And while Jeremiah Ross, the man behind the masked gimmick, was certainly talented, he was no Y2J or Latino Heat if we're being honest. No, he was someone who could always put on a good match, but who maybe didn't have the same level of personality of those other performers, meaning that he was never able to connect with audiences in the same way as them. Still, this didn't stop him from having some pretty good moments in WCW, such as when he had notable matches against Billy Kidman, Juventud Guerrera, and Dean Malenko. So good did these matches make him look, in fact, in 1999, readers of the Wrestling Observer newsletter would vote Blitzkrieg as the Rookie of the Year. So it's a shame he was never really able to make it to that next level then, because despite continuing to be a stalwart of the cruiserweight division throughout 2000, by that point, the overall booking of the company wasn't doing him any favors. And so it was that come October of this year, he'd leave WCW behind, with him at that point retiring from the ring altogether. Again, could he have been more? Absolutely, as he certainly had the talent required. But with him never hanging around for long enough to be part of the WWF buyout in 2001, we'll never know if Vince McMahon would have given Blitzkrieg an opportunity at this point. No, that part of his story will always remain a major what-if. But he's not the biggest what-if to come out of WCW back then, as an arguably even bigger case of this can be found in our next subject, the artist formerly known as Prince Aaka. Yes, if there was anyone in today's video you were going to remember, then this might be the one. And that's because, outside of him having a very memorable name, one which was inspired by his part namesake Prince and his own artist formerly known as phase during the early to mid-90s, Aaka actually had more than a few highlights during his run with WCW. Hell, on two separate occasions between 1996 and 2000, he'd become WCW Cruiserweight Champion, once after winning the vacant belt in February of 2000, and then a second time from Billy Kidman in March of 2000, because WCW in 2000 was a very special place. And as if that wasn't enough, he'd even become a one-time television champion a few years prior to that back in 1997 when he pinned Lord Steven Regal for the honor. Of course, back then he was still going by the name of plain old Prince Aaka, with his gimmick here being that he was a high-flying superstar in waiting who was able to hold his own against high-level opponents such as Rey Mysterio, Ultimo Dragon, and Syxx. And when he wasn't doing that down in Atlanta, he was even being sent over to New Japan Pro Wrestling to work there for a while as part of the working relationship the two promotions had, something he would not have been able to do had he not been able to go in the ring. Hell, in 1998, he even got to have a short program with Chris Jericho, surely one of the high points of his entire run. Once that was over, though, a change would be required, and so this was why he chose to become the artist formerly known as Prince Aaka instead. Someone who, with his valet Paisley, aka Booker T's wife Sharmell by his side, began leaning more and more into the Prince comparisons. And if you need any evidence that this worked out for him, you only have to look to the fact that this was when he became a two-time Cruiserweight champion. Sadly, however, by the time the summer of 2000 came around, Prince Aaka's time in WCW would have ended, and with WWF apparently having no interest in him, he was left to spend the rest of his career working on the indie circuit in places like Jimmy Hart's ex-Wrestling Federation. Sure, you could argue that he deserved better, but at least he got to have those runs with the Cruiserweight title before all was said and done. And that's a silver lining we could also apply to our next subject today, Lenny Lane. Forgotten about Lenny Lane? Well, there's probably a reason for that, and that reason came through no fault of his own, because despite having a promising early run with WCW between 1997 and 1999, during which time he was able to mix it up with folks such as Ultimo Guerrero and Juventud Guerrera, all while becoming a lackey to Chris Jericho, come 1999, things started to go off the rails for the Duluth native somewhat. What happened here? Well, unfortunately, it was down to the booking. That's right, after it was decided by WCW's booking team that Lane needed a new gimmick to help him reach that next level, he began partnering up with Lodi to form the West Hollywood Blondes, a play on Steve Austin and Brian Pillman's Old Hollywood Blondes tag team. Yes, it is true that this was also the period that saw Leonard Carlson, the man behind the gimmick, briefly win the Cruiserweight title when he beat Rey Mysterio for the honor on the August 19, 1999 episode of Thunder. But then his character wouldn't even last long enough to get going after this, as the gimmick would soon be axed and he would instead be repackaged as part of the Standards and Practices team, basically WCW's version of the Right to Censor. And it wasn't as if Standards and Practices were successful for the time either, because despite getting TV time, they were almost always overshadowed by their secretary, Miss Hancock, someone who, despite her outward appearance, had a fondness for dancing on tables during the middle of matches. So it was then that come the summer of 2000, Lenny Lane would make his exit from WCW and instead spend the rest of his career mostly working on the independent circuit, with his only real sniff at the big time following this being when he had a couple of appearances with WWE during an episode of Sunday Night Heat in 2004, and then again on WWECW in 2008, or when he briefly reformed the West Hollywood Blondes in TNA with our next subject, Kwee-Wee. Yes, Kwee-Wee might be mostly remembered for his wild haircut and the fact that he was also managed by Sharmell. In fact, the most notable thing he ever did was develop an angry alter ego later on during his run, an alter ego named Angry Allen, which was supposed to be his version of Bruce Banner turning into the Hulk. Yes, we truly have no idea what WCW was thinking with this one. And so it should come as absolutely no surprise then that after getting into brief feuds with the likes of Prince Iaukea and Jason Jett, the latter of which he wrestled at the company's final pay-per-view, Greed, in March of 2001, WWF expressed no interest in bringing Kwee-Wee on board once they bought WCW out mere days later. So instead of heading over to the WWF, Alan Funk, the man behind the character, spent the remainder of his career doing shots for places like TNA and All Japan Pro Wrestling, with him at some point somehow managing to become Miss TNA in the latter. Maybe he should have done what our next subject did then when he got himself out of WCW before it all collapsed. Who are we talking about here? Why, Damian 666, of course. That's right, we're really getting into the weeds of obscure characters here, because despite the fact he was a pretty good wrestler, not many people talk about Damian 666 anymore. Why is he so obscure? Well, because he never really did a huge amount during his time with the company. No, after joining WCW in 1996, Damian 666 would mostly serve as a body for others in the Cruiserweight division to beat whenever they needed a win. And when Leonardo Gomez, the man behind the face paint, wasn't doing that, he was doing the exact same thing with a whole other character, a masked performer who went by the name of Galaxy. Was it ever acknowledged that these two characters were being played by the same person? No, but at least it gave the Tijuana native additional opportunities to show what he could do in the ring. And he'd need every opportunity he could get, because we struggle to think of any notable victory he got during his time with WCW. Really, the biggest moment he had while working there was probably when he became a member of Eddie Guerrero's Latino World Order. That said, even in this group he'd be relegated to the role of designated pin eater. And so it wasn't like his star had a chance to shine as a result of his association with Latino heat. No, Gomez's career wouldn't really get going in any real way until he left WCW behind in 1999, and from there returned to his native Mexico, where he got to work for several years in a variety of different promotions, with him at points becoming a trios champion in both AAA and CMLL. And to make matters better for Damian 666, he was able to do all of this while continuing to team up with a friend of his who he'd first aligned himself with in World Championship Wrestling. A friend who just happens to be our next subject, the man who went by the name of Ciclope. Yes, Ciclope may be best remembered for wearing a mask designed to make it look like he had one eye. And sadly, that's about the most notable thing we can say about this gimmick, as outside of that, he didn't do much during his time with the company. The only real thing of note about him was a brief moment when his character was inserted into the feud between Chris Jericho and Dean Malenko in 1998, though that wasn't so much Ciclope getting a big win, and more a case of his mask being used as a disguise. That's right, it was while entering a battle royal where the winner would be granted a shot at Y2J's Cruiserweight title that Dean Malenko decided to disguise himself as the One-Eyed Lucha so as to take his rival by surprise. So even in his most memorable moment, Ciclope wasn't actually there. Perhaps it's for the best then that once he left WCW in 1999 and returned to his home country of Mexico, Manuel Partida would drop the Cyclops aspect of his gimmick and instead transform himself into the arguably even weirder Halloween character, a luchador we only assume either really enjoyed the autumn holidays or was a huge fan of John Carpenter's filmography. Either way, we wouldn't see him in WCW again once his first run there ended, because as we all know, by 2001, that company would be out of business entirely. But let's move away from the dying days of World Championship Wrestling for a moment, and instead move over to an earlier time when it was in better health, as it's then that our next subject worked there, Norman the Lunatic. Now, if the name Norman the Lunatic doesn't ring any bells, then maybe this one will. Bastion Booger. That's right, during mid-90s WWF, Mike Shaw had the dishonor of having one of the worst gimmicks of the time period. Not that his time in WCW between 1989 and 1991 was much better though. No, there, rather than playing this role, he'd play the character of a crazy person who'd apparently just escaped hospital, given the fact that he was still wearing a hospital gown whenever he came down to the ring. And whenever he did make his way to the squared circle, Norman the Lunatic would be managed by Teddy Long. And we're not exactly sure why, but Long felt it necessary to control his client with a big key, much in the same way Paul Bearer would control The Undertaker with an urn. Was this meant to be a threat that he'd be locked up again if he didn't do his manager's bidding? Who knows? It was never made clear, nor was it made clear why he carried a teddy bear down to the ring. And if all of this has painted the picture of a massive botch for WCW Creative, then let us just add one more point to blow your minds. Norman the Lunatic once challenged then NWA World Champion Ric Flair one-on-one in the ring. Truly, WCW during its early years was a unique place where a lot of strange things could happen and a lot of weird characters could thrive. But let's move away from WCW's early days and back to its dark days in the 2000s, as it's here where we'll find our next subject, Reno. Now, many fans might be wondering who the heck Reno was. Well, the answer to that question was he was an undercard performer who appeared in WCW from 1999 onwards, right up until the company's death at the dawn of the new millennium. Obviously then, this represented pretty terrible timing for him, as that was the period the Atlanta promotion was falling apart at the seams. And so, it's perhaps no surprise that given how much turmoil was going on both on and off screen here, he has pretty much gone forgotten. Sure, it didn't help that his gimmick of a shoot-fighting martial artist didn't quite get over with fans, perhaps because the idea of an MMA fighter inside a wrestling ring wouldn't fully work until years later, when the likes of Brock Lesnar and Ronda Rousey made it main event worthy. And it certainly didn't help matters that after joining the Natural Born Thrillers, he'd find himself in the role of on-screen enforcer to Vince Russo, someone who many fans had grown to dislike by this point. But at least there was a small silver lining in the fact that Reno got to win the WCW Hardcore title before all was said and done. Would he have preferred more? We've no doubt he would have, but when you were working for World Championship Wrestling at the turn of the millennium, you had to work with what you were given. And if this meant spending the final months of the company's existence feuding with people like Vito and Sean Stasiak, then so be it. It was better than doing nothing at all. Unfortunately though, this wouldn't be enough to convince WWE to use the Buffalo native on their main roster following Vince McMahon's buyout of WCW. And because of that then, the majority of what remained of Reno's career would be spent working for World Wrestling All-Stars in Australia before he hung up his boots for good in 2003.